It's not an easy task, in fact, to introduce Olivia's practice, in a way, as she's an example of an artist that resists the idea to capture her visual practice into words, and is simultaneously extremely picky about the right choice of words. This is probably not surprising for an artist who doesn't only make 2- and 3-dimensional objects, installations and videos, but also writes poetry. The current exhibition, Neither Here Nor There, Nor Fish Nor Fowl at Schloss Ringenberg in Germany, which includes Olivia's work, revolves around artistic practices that express a desire, and then I'm quoting, a desire to embrace our inability to grasp something in its entirety, unquote, and that, quote, attempts to escape from a rational transfer of information and inhabit a non-language of withdrawal and refusal, unquote. And this actually seems a pretty accurate description of what it is that her work does. And I'm going to leave it to that. If you want to see more of it, you can join us to Nieuwe Vida, or go to Germany for the show at Ringenberg. And, well, included in Natalie's invitation to both of us was the incentive to think of the muse from the perspective of the world of objects, and to challenge the perspective of the muse as an objectified, disempowered something. An interesting perspective in a time in which new materialist philosophers stress the urgency to rethink the idea of matter as passive stuff, as raw, brute, or inert, as Jane Bennett does, for instance, in her publication Vibrant Matter, A Political Ecology of Things from 2010. In that book, she speaks of the capacity of things, edibles, commodities, storms, metals, not only to impede or block the will and designs of humans, but also to act as quasi-agents or forces with trajectories, propensities, or tendencies of their own. She points at the vitality of matter and the lively powers of material formations, such as the way omega-3 fatty acids can alter human moods, or the way our trash is not away in landfills, but generating lively streams of chemicals and volatile winds of methane as we speak. Olivia and myself held several conversations in the past weeks. Today we will present to you a condensed reading of these. In the context of this symposium, Olivia ended up with thoughts, at least at first, surrounding memory and the idea of language as a muse. The first part of our talk consists of the presentation of a text that Olivia has been formatting especially for this discussion, and my own responses to that afterwards in the form of questions to Olivia are to a large extent colored by my curatorial research of the past 3 years into the writings of Asger Jorn, the Danish artist and thinker who co-founded groups such as Cobra and the Situationist International.
Maybe I will use the mic because I'm not always so good in projecting my voice. Before I read this text, I just say briefly kind of introduction to the ideas that I had when Natalie invited me to talk about what the muse as object could possibly be. And as Hilde pointed out, this is in my work. I think if I would invite the muse into it, it would be something about the reception and distribution of language as I understand like input and output, and why do we come to the meanings that we have agreed upon. So I have kind of some notes that are a bit loose, but I guess in the stuff that I have been looking at in the last couple of years, the only thing that I could really relate to the older idea of muse is something maybe having to do with like object-oriented ontology, which in one way I'm actually not that interested in for many reasons, but I'm fascinated by the fact that it has become such a popular discourse, because obviously I think people are finding it very relevant for reasons that they either think they can or can't explain. But I watched this BBC film of Alice in Wonderland, like when I was a kid. I think it's from 1965. It's in black and white. It's very good. And I watched it again recently, and I was really struck by this one sentence that I have never noticed before, because the text that I'm going to read is kind of part of a project that I'm calling at the moment, Do You Know What I Mean, or Do You? And in Alice in Wonderland, at some point, the queen asks a question. It's not that important what the question is. And then the queen follows up by saying, or shouldn't I ask? And I thought that this is so lovely that there's two questions posed, but they're not two different questions. One question is the question, and the second question is, or shouldn't I ask the question? So that's, yeah, maybe that will make a bit of sense later on. And the other point, which may or may not make sense now, is that I was also, like, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is about the idea of orientation. What is orientation? Which, yeah, I guess this is also in the object-oriented ontology literally, and then other ways that it's used, like sexual orientation. And I've been thinking about, like, in language, that maybe a prefix is a kind of orientation. So we have a lot of different words where you can notice this, but in the context of the muse, maybe like inspiration and expiration, they have the same root word, but the prefix gives it an orientation in terms of how we use it and what it means. Or dissonance and resonance, this kind of thing. So maybe that's all I'll say about that for now. And so yeah, now I'm going to read a text which is kind of called Do You Know What I Mean, or Do You? Recently, a team of 3 deep-sea researchers discovered a new species of hydroplastic flora. Visible in particular regions and only at specific times, this plant species survives in the absence of heat and light and does not experience photosynthesis, as above-ground growing plants exposed to daylight do. Instead, these hydroplastic flora, called anacognite, after the Latin prefix ana, meaning against, and cognito, meaning to know or recognize, receive nutrients from the waters that surround them. Dead and decaying matter, other sea creatures, flora and fauna alike, leave nutrient traces that are in turn absorbed by deep-sea plants. When asked about the name anacognite, the first researcher alluded to the cultural and figurative significance of depth. Western societies tend to associate depth with vastness, obscurity, and a sense of the infinite in terms of knowledge. The name anacognite is a response to the phenomenon of nomination in regards to recognition. That typically, Western cultures identify objects, things, ourselves, and each other based on thinking and to some extent agreeing that we know what we are looking at, tasting, feeling, hearing, and smelling. Our perception is determined in and through the translation of external input into language, agreement, recognition, and knowledge. In short, we privilege an economy of intellect over the supposed extravagance of sensation. The first researcher expressed skepticism that agreement and recognition provide a sound basis for meaning-making, and suggested instead that an idea of dissonant practice would be more suited for the transmission and sharing of perceptual phenomenon, all perception in general, aka everything. Dissonant practice is the bearing of inconsistent reverberations. Taken literally, it is the work to sound different or to sound apart. In the context of perception, it is the practice of experience prior to recognition. Without a name, the anacognite is, simply put, something that nobody has ever seen before. Through dissonant practice, this unrecognizable creature is not something to be discovered. Rather, it is and has been existing differently and apart, in the sense that its existence has not been determined by our knowledge of it. The 20th century poet Laura Riding Jackson wrote that there is a sense of life so real that it becomes the sense of something more real than life. This sentence could be used to express how anything that exists can move from a state of being unknown to a state of being discovered, to a state of being named, to a state of being known, to the brink of extinction and ultimately death. If we did not have any sense of life, we would not have any sense of reality. If we did not have any sense of reality, we would not have any sense of loss. If we did not have any sense of loss, we would not have any sense of life. The sense of something more real than life is the sense that life exists whether we sense it or not. To quote Jackson, there is a sense of life so real it becomes the sense of something more real than life. It introduces a principle of selection into the undifferentiating quantitative appetite, and thus changes accidental emotional forms into deliberate intellectual forms. It is the meaning at work in that which has no meaning. It is, at its clearest, poetry, end quote. The second researcher described first citing the Acognite. Initially, I thought it was a sculpture or a knot of plastic bags. The third researcher elaborated on the second researcher's statement. Yeah, but how would we know the difference anyway? The difference, asked the second researcher. I mean, continued the third one, a knot of plastic bags could be a sculpture. Sorry, I have to go between documents. In recent months, I've been thinking that perception develops between things, as I want to understand how the perception of myself by others manifests my sense of subjectivity, my identity, or what it means to feel the same or similar as something else. That identity would be a shared relational category, rather than an intersubjective condition. When asked to reflect on the muse, I noticed the link between reception, how I'm thinking of the term inspiration, and memory, as the muses in ancient Greek mythology are the daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne, the god of the sky and the god of memory, respectively. So then I wondered about the difference between inspiration, or input, and thought, or remembering, as output. In modern English, the verb to muse means to be absorbed in thought. Imagine a sponge sucking up liquid. The sponge does so by virtue of its materiality, or so we think, or so we project. We accept that the sponge does not have a consciousness that gives it the agency to choose or intend to be absorbent. It just does what a sponge is supposed to do. Otherwise, it could be mistaken for something else, like a sculpture or an object. Figures of speech, like being absorbed, inflect a poetic potential towards a subject or an object. In queer phenomenology, orientations, objects, others, Sarah Ahmed expresses orientation in terms of space rather than in terms of identity, or at least that identity is a byproduct of proximity and distance, as well as what we are towards, or about, or around, or directed to. Ahmed writes the following about disorientation. Moments of disorientation are vital. They are bodily experiences that throw the world up, or throw the body from its ground. Disorientation as a bodily feeling can be unsettling, and it can shatter one's sense of confidence if the ground, or one's belief that the ground on which we reside, can support the actions that make a life feel livable. Such a feeling of shattering or of being shattered might persist and become a crisis, or the feeling itself might pass as the ground returns or as we return to the ground. The body might be reoriented if the hand that reaches out finds something to steady in action, or the hand might reach out and find nothing and might grasp instead the indeterminacy of air. End quote. When prompted to think about the muse as totem or object, I thought about orientation, not in terms of objects-oriented ontology, but more in terms of what it means to be identifiable. I would propose then a queer relationship to objects, which would be about disorientation, to train perception so that experience is not only influenced by memory, received impressions, and the qualities they invoke in language, and therefore matter, but also by the dissolution of identitarian positions as the past moves into the present, to be both dreamer and dreamed, sleeper and slept.
So, Olivia, you just said that you want to understand how the perception of yourself by others manifests your sense of subjectivity, your identity, or what it means to feel the same or similar as something else. That identity would be a shared relational category rather than an intersubjective condition. In an earlier talk that the two of us had, you elaborated more on the notion of sameness and similarity. And I think these ideas might become of interest when thinking about the world of matter or the organization of matter. So perhaps we could step into these ideas again.
Sameness does not necessarily imply the property of being identical, but does evoke identification or identity in terms of what things represent and how they represent each other. In his book, How Forests Think, the anthropologist Eduardo Kohn writes the following in the context of his time spent with the Runa people in Ecuador. The linguist Emile Benveniste observes that the pronouns I and you position interlocutors intersubjectively through mutual address, and accordingly he considers these true person pronouns. By contrast, the third person is more accurately a non-person. It refers to something outside of the discursive interaction. If we extend this reasoning to trans-species encounters, then jaguars and humans, in this act of looking back and at each other, would, in a sense, become persons to each other. And in the process, the Runa, in a way, would also become jaguars. So in this passage of this book, the writer is talking about this group of people living in Ecuador where when they go hunting in the jungle, they've learned that they have to lie flat on their backs and face the sky when they sleep. This is, I assume, through trial and error, because if they don't do that, the jaguars will kill and eat them, thinking that they're prey. So they're making a shared language with the jaguars, and this is what I think Emile Benveniste is also talking about as the third position. So instead of having just human and jaguar, you have a third thing, which is not necessarily human jaguar or jaguar human, but something in between. So the point there is about this third thing. Oh, you want it? It sounds good, doesn't it?
Thank you. So, when you were talking about the world of matter and our perception of it, and that we privilege an economy of intellect over the supposed extravagance of sensation, I was reminded of Asger Jorn's statement that it is no longer possible to base scientific proof on direct observation. What he meant by that is that scientists draw conclusions based no longer on the sensation of the object itself, but on signs of the object's behavior deciphered by measuring instruments, on photographic plates, and so on. Think of an airplane taking off and how you could prove that. It becomes smaller by taking photographs of it, whereas in reality it stays the same size, of course. Jorn then criticized the value attributed to these signs, the signs becoming the only criteria for the demonstrability of scientific statements. And he said, the important thing is to demonstrate that we do not see or sense what is at all, but what happens. That the camera is completely unable to maintain a picture or object of what is, only of what happens, of the instant, however long or short that is. What would be your perspective on this?
So to answer this question, I want to show a video, which is called Dr. Quantum, Wave Particle Duality and the Observer. But before you press play, I was watching this video with a friend, and I didn't understand exactly what's going on, but I think that what's going on, as I can understand it, is that there's an electron, and in this experiment, which you'll see, which maybe all of you will understand, essentially the situation gets divided into that which is being observed or not observed, which is the electron, and that which is observing or not observing, which is the scientist. So again, it's like the two category thing, like the human and the jaguar. And I'm wondering, like, what is the other thing that is happening? And I kind of think of this in...
And here we are.
I kind of think of this in relation to, I think it's, I don't know, someone told me this is a Zen cone, but I don't know if it's actually from Zen, that if a tree falls in the woods and nobody's there to hear it, does it make a sound? And I always thought this was a very funny question, and in different moments of like being stoned, I would try to think of different questions that it could be, like if a tree falls in the wood and no one's there to hear it, did you hear it? Like this kind of stoner thinking where you can somehow twist the language to the point where actually you realize that, or I realize that it's a ridiculous question to ask because you were doing something else. So then you can start to think about other things like, well, why weren't you there? Or what were you doing instead? Or what did you hear instead? And likewise, that the concerns of the tree, it's not about it being indifferent to the listener or the human, but more like maybe something else happened. So now maybe we can...
the granddaddy of all quantum weirdness, the infamous double slit experiment. To understand this experiment, we first need to see how particles, or little balls of matter, act. If we randomly shoot a small object, say a marble, at the screen, we see a pattern on the back wall where they went through the slit and hit. Now, if we add a second slit, we would expect to see a second band duplicated to the right. Now, let's look at waves. The waves hit the slit and radiate out, striking the back wall with the most intensity directly in line with the slit. The line of brightness on the back screen shows that intensity. This is similar to the line the marbles make. But when we add the second slit, something different happens. If the top of one wave meets the bottom of another wave, they cancel each other out. So now there is an interference pattern on the back wall. Places where the two tops meet are the highest intensity, the bright lines, and where they cancel, there is nothing. So when we throw things, that is matter, through two slits, we get this, two bands of hits. And with waves, we get an interference pattern of many bands. Good so far. Now, let's go quantum. An electron is a tiny, tiny bit of matter, like a tiny marble. Let's fire a stream through one slit. It behaves just like the marble, a single band. So, if we shoot these tiny bits through two slits, we should get, like the marbles, two bands. What? An interference pattern. We fired electrons, tiny bits of matter through. But we get a pattern like waves, not like little marbles. How? How could pieces of matter create an interference pattern like a wave? It doesn't make sense. But physicists are clever. They thought, maybe those little balls are bouncing off each other and creating that pattern. So they decide to shoot electrons through one at a time. There is no way they could interfere with each other. But after an hour of this, the same interference pattern is seen to emerge. The conclusion is inescapable. The single electron leaves as a particle, becomes a wave of potentials, goes through both slits, and interferes with itself to hit the wall like a particle. But mathematically, it's even stranger. It goes through both slits and it goes through neither. And it goes through just one and it goes through just the other. All of these possibilities are in superposition with each other. But physicists were completely baffled by this. So they decided to peek and see which slit it actually goes through. They put a measuring device by one slit to see which one it went through and let it fly. But the quantum world is far more mysterious than they could have imagined. When they observed, the electron went back to behaving like a little marble. It produced a pattern of two bands, not an interference pattern of many. The very act of measuring or observing which slit it went through meant it only went through one, not both. The electron decided to act differently, as though it was aware it was being watched. And it was here that physicists stepped forever into the strange, never world of quantum events. What is matter? Marbles or waves? And waves of what? And what does an observer have to do with any of this? The observer collapsed the wave function simply by observing.
So, Olivia, I have a more general question about your line of thinking in relation to language. Would it be perhaps more correct to say that it is not necessarily language that you're exploring as a muse for today, but that it's rather the dynamic relationships of matter and how things matter, to use the word in two senses?
Now, again, we can show some videos. But before you press play, I think the electron video for me, I'm very interested in science, and I also don't know, like, I don't think I'm ever gonna, I don't have a scientific mind, but for me this is quite an interesting example of like the concept of, or shouldn't I ask? Like, if I observe it, does it do this, or shouldn't I ask? And in terms of the question, I think that, I mean, also, if I'm thinking of the way that, like, I'm trying to understand why am I doing anything, or how is my relation to other things, language or objects, am I changing it, is it changing me, is it some kind of collaboration, or shouldn't I ask? These are two examples of, like, that I can't understand exactly, but it seems to be happening. So one is a compilation of long distance shots, like insane shots from the 2013-14 NBA regular season. It's 14 minutes long, we won't watch the whole thing. And the second one is this tabla player, and these are just two examples that I have been looking at recently. And I think, like, really formally, literally, these are quite good examples of how things act upon each other, and it sort of seems like a mutual third thing that is being produced. So maybe now we can play this one.
Where is here?
From the beginning.
Ray Allen responsible for their last 9 points. No! He made that one too. Get out of town, Ray Allen.
You got it going on, you got it going on. Ray Allen all the way from way downtown. And then he poses Jesus Shuttlesworth at work.
The buzzer and missed. Rebound follow won't go. Clippers get it back with 2 seconds. With 1, Crawford from 50 feet. Big shot, bingo! And that...
This is the guy you want in his hands, Crawford. Pull up 3. Oh, Jordan, get out of here. Whoa! Jordan Crawford with 19.
He's 3 for 3 on the season. He hit 9 all of last year in the playoffs, and the Kings respond with a bank 3. Ben McLemore, he's good.
Tabla video is next. What I think is amazing about this also is that it's happening over and over again. Like, you can watch 300 hours of all of these amazing shots that have been made, but of course they're not being made all the time, but they're being made sometimes. But the fact that they're being made sometimes is kind of like what the point actually is. And I guess it's only through practice in a way that this is possible. Also with the tabla playing that we're gonna watch, it's a thing of practice. So then I start to think maybe perception is also a thing about practice. Okay, and so then the other thing I want to say about that is that, like, I guess probably all, I mean, people that are artists have this experience, and in lots of other ways you can have the experience where you practice something enough that you know what you're doing so well that you don't have to know anymore what you're doing. And I think that's also, like, for me, that's a really interesting relationship to materials, or like the tabla or the basketball, where through the repetition you can actually know so much that you don't know anymore. I was going to say something else, but I forgot. Maybe that's all.
So another question that I extracted from our conversations is that you mentioned to me that you wonder if being able to represent something means being the same as it. You wondered if your sense of self or your sense of thought and environment would be identical with yours, as in something being made in the image of something else, but not in a godlike sense, but as in being actually the same. In relation to this, you brought up the notion of ongoing composition and the form of mise en abîme. Does the mise en abîme, an image containing the same image, which means that that image contains again the same image and so on, symbolize an idea of the ongoing composition? Let me first show two visual examples of the mise en abîme. Okay, never mind. One example might be enough. So this is an animated version of a work by Escher, in which they show how the trick is done. Version of a work by Escher, in which they show how the trick is done. I thought this was an extra nice example. The other example is the famous Arnolfini portrait by the Van Eyck brothers, where you see the couple, and in the back there's a mirror that mirrors that also shows the couple, and so on. But this, because it's an animated video of that principle, you also immediately get this idea of the vastness of this endless depth that the researcher in your text also talks about. Yeah, and then you're supposed to just respond to that without me asking any particular question.
What did I write? I think, yeah, I've written definition of mise en abîme, but that's a bit obvious.
To put into an
to
abyss.
Put into an abyss, yeah. I think, I mean, that like the idea of seeing the same thing that is the same thing and reproducing something, I guess I wonder what other kind of faculties could indicate sameness. So instead of something looking like it's the same as something else, which I think like in painting that's what mise en abîme means, but also if already looking at something has all of these processes of recognition where you think, I mean, there's all of the functions of the brain or whatever, you think that you're seeing something or you know that you're seeing something. Then also I was wondering if actually the idea of an image that is the same or something that is the same as something else could also be other than just that it looks the same. And I think that's also maybe what identifying with something or even identifying something or something being identifiable means that you can identify it. So does that mean that you also can identify with it? And I know that this word can be used in different ways. But maybe I didn't put this in my answer, but I think many of my friends have already heard this story, but in the sculpture that I have in the new beach, so there's like a stone that has a turtle on the side of the stone, and the idea of this, I thought that I was thinking of a mise en abîme, but I don't know if it actually is that a turtle is swimming in the ocean, and again there's like 3 categories, so there's a turtle, a shark, and you, and you're watching a turtle swimming in the ocean, and then a shark comes from above, and ordinarily the shark would eat the turtle, but it looks down at the turtle and it sees actually a painting because the turtle has a painting of a turtle on its shell, but from above the shark thinks that it's looking at a painting, so it keeps swimming, it doesn't kill it, but it's not because it thinks it's fake, it thinks that it's looking at a real painting, it just wouldn't eat a painting. So I thought that that's an example of mise en abîme, like an image within an image. I don't know if it's actually that, like it's not like this, but somehow in my mind that makes sense. Because it's still the idea of, like, yeah, so then I was thinking, is that also part of it, that something looks like something else or you could mistake something for something else because you think that it's an image. So then you're looking at an image inside an image because everything is an image.
Yeah. So there will be time for questions, but I feel that it would be good to end, not with a conclusion perhaps, but with expressing the hope that for you present today, your Olivia's words called an interesting picture to mind of a world in which, first of all, the distinction between oneself and another is experienced as a far less clearly marked in terms of boundaries, a world in which there's a deep and heartfelt awareness of the fact that, let's say, everything is reflected in everything else. And in terms of the notion of the muse, well, perhaps that suggests that instead of identifying the muse, objectified or not, as an identity not outside ourselves, but as an inclusive type of identity. And that secondly, a world is sketched in which the politics of disorientation, and I'm actually summarizing what is also said about Sarah Ahmed's book that you brought up, that the politics of disorientation is a common practice which allows a continuous putting of non-obvious objects and others within reach.
That's a really beautiful note to end on. Thank you for that, Hilde. Are there questions from the audience? And thank you to
Oh, yeah.
here.
Yeah.
Could you repeat the question?
If there is any question, I will definitely repeat it.
I think it was very interesting the way that I think the thanks first of all, which was very beautiful. I think that in relation to the muse that we're talking during all that I listened, had the image of the waves in my mind. That the waves on the beach is also repetition, it's infinite, it's sameness, it's similarity, but the same as the picture pattern that either through the basketball example or the quantum physical example or the painting example, you 100%. Well, I mean, if you just suspend your fear of where is the location of things, then you can just get the new news by the repetition that are ongoing. Isn't it? You know, I don't know how you relate to that. How you
Okay, yeah, I remind you, I have to summarize your question now, or to repeat it actually. It is a comment, a very nice one, saying that that you come to think of the world of objects maybe, or the idea of a muse being as a like marked or separate entity outside ourselves, that you come to think of it differently, that we somehow managed to bring about a picture of a world in which consists of waves, perhaps. And there was an earlier version of our talk in which I expanded more on some of the ideas of Asker Jorn, which also I think Natalie probably had in mind when she invited me. That is one of the things you remembered probably from the earlier talk at Nieuwe Vida, where Jorn discusses the idea that actually he calls the arabesque shape. To him, he identifies it through, he was immensely interested in mathematics and physics as well, and everything else you can possibly imagine. But so he identifies the arabesque as the grammar of substance, basically. He says, look, and this is so nice that you got this picture of the beach, because he says, look at the patterns that the wind blows in the beach and the patterns in the sky. And when we look at the rotation curves of the planets, we also see similar shapes, and he takes it far. And he relates it also to the notion of ornamentation, that it is something that comes naturally, that the world is ornamentation in a way. So that it's very nice that you bring that up.
Arvo Pärt just explains the minimal music like as being inspired by this grammar of the beat, the waves. They're just always repetitive, but they're never the same. But yet also, you know, it falls into place very beautifully. But by just not thinking about the linear grammar, but the patternful pattern.
Yes, patterns. Yes, patterns. Yeah, I never thought about it in relation to music or sound actually, but that's another nice, interesting link. Yeah, I'm so visually oriented, terrible. But would you like to respond to the comment, or?
I thought it was quite a good response. Maybe I just say one thing, which is that I also was thinking, like, in the context of the wave and the all the factors involved, like the wind and then the sand, and the water leaves an impression on the sand, I guess the wind doesn't make an impression in the water, but it is somehow also moving it. That I think that's like all of those factors combined, if you can necessarily figure out like what is the main actor or something, like I would hope that this is also that it can somehow displace again the idea of the observer, that the human is the observer, which is also something that for me is missing in like the OOO discourse or post-humanism, that it's not really, like I was thinking in the earlier talk about mutation or the mutant and the snake, and I think that there also, like, the term alien is interesting for me because I'm curious about how something can be as phenomenal as the fact of the wave and the sand and the wind, and that maybe actually your existence looking at this or perceiving it is somehow also that's strange, maybe.
Wat krijgen we nu? Shall I maybe just give the microphone, because it's in reality really difficult to repeat. You don't want? No? No, I'm fine. Okay. Yeah.
I guess I'm trying to articulate. I'm really interested in this idea of identification as a connection of sameness or differentiation, and how that process of becoming involves perhaps a vacillation between, let's say, seeing something and deciding process of actually differentiating oneself as a means of identifying. And then with the video of the electrons, which was really great, actually, I really enjoyed that. There was this moment where he talks about how when the electrons go through these slits, they actually disorient themselves or interfere with themselves in a way in the process of becoming themselves. And I don't know, I just wanted to sort of ask you like what you thought about, I guess, identification as a process of disorientation or becoming. That makes sense? Or I'm just kind of like blah blah blah, but you can do that back to me. And
No, that makes sense. I mean, I think that's why the electron video is very resonant for me, because this is something that like the idea of that identification is about sharing something as opposed to being about a subject, like subjective, intersubjective condition. That it's sort of like it's a process towards something, like you said, that through this disorientation, then they're becoming themselves. So then I think in a way that for me is much more interesting to think of identity as disorienting rather than orienting, because the fact of even having to like I meant pose like not in terms of like poser, but like literally like hold your body or speak or whatever in order to make yourself discernible to somebody else. I think that is disorienting, and I think that like even though it sounds maybe like something negative, that in my mind is a much more positive way that any idea of community could be formed, because it's no longer about like, oh, we are all the same. It's actually like, no, we're all going through this process of having to make ourselves visible and audible and whatever to each other, which is totally disorienting, but somehow that's the only way that we can actually end up sharing something, maybe.
also, like, the connection between, for me, like, the electrons being watched, let's say, which preempts their disorientation or something. And I thought a lot of, and their sense of becoming or interference. And I thought a lot about, I came up in my mind a lot, Jose Esteban Munoz, I don't know if you ever read his book, Disidentification, but he talks a lot about kind of how queer performance and this process of self-determining queer performance. So, meaning drag or just, gender transgressive behavior or trans people, being this process of disidentifying and ostensibly disorienting oneself and the rest of the world. And, but I don't know, I'll stop. But I just thought, like, what was interesting to me was that electrons were framed as though they just did this sort of naturally on their own through the process of being watched. So there's a question as to why. And then I thought about kind of queer performance being one myself, and how self-determination is like this term that's thrown around a lot in the queer community, the idea of being you, deciding yourself, who you are, and dismantling through it. But of course, does one ever really decide? We don't know.
Yeah, totally, and that's, I mean, absolutely, that's the tension, right, is like, that on the one hand, I mean, this is what has happened already, is that on the one hand, we want to be able to say like, no, I was like born this way or whatever, but then it's like, no, actually I chose this, but then actually I was born this way, and then I chose this, and now I'm choosing this, and there's sort of like, because I guess the society or politics or whatever is always changing, then of course, what is seen as being like the kind of right way to talk about that is also changing, but that's also why it was like thinking of, I mean, this is super linguistic nerdy, but like thinking of a prefix as an orientation makes so much sense to me, because that's literally what's happening, like transgender. I always think, okay, it's fucking sad that we still have to use the word gender. That doesn't make any sense. But okay, so you put something in front of it, and then that orients it one way, and then all the other people can like be like, okay, so that is this plus this. And then I suppose like with the LGBTQI whatever, it's the same thing. It's like, okay, this plus this plus this plus this, and then at some point do we have to invent a new alphabet, and then someone has then, and so I totally agree with you. That's always like, that's also with the electron thing, but I think that's kind of hopeful for me, because the electrons aren't people, so it's like somehow you can have a lot of empathy for the fact that they just get to have their own thing,
One more question, and then
Mine was quick. I was just thinking about the impossibility of a future impossibility of not asking. And the thing is with the electron is that it's being asked. Sometimes there's spontaneous superposition collapse, like wave function collapse happens naturally very rarely, where without being observed, the waves do whatever the particles do what they want, and without observation. And potentially in the future, instead of people being asked what they are, what they want to be, nobody's asking anything necessarily in a direct, observable way, you know?
Nice idea. Also thinking about the muse maybe again.
Well, no.
Just not ask.
There must be like, old-fashioned proverbs your grandma would have told you, actually, and like the magnet. What? But no, I know. I'm assuming there must be some kind of
No, but it's not about not asking. It's about not even. It's about
not needing.
The first question that the Queen is asking, not necessarily even being proposed.
Mm-hmm.
That was very clear that that's what you meant.
Yeah, I just.
And everyone is just being.
No, exactly. And then unfortunately, like, what are the reasons that people have to answer to those questions, and that the questions are asked is because of like fucked up shit.
Yeah, but the problem that I have in physics at the moment is that some people think that consciousness exists, though the word exists for consciousness to observe it. That is, and that's it.
Yeah, it's really like a one-way kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Question, remark, and was relationship to, we're mostly focusing on patterns, the abyss, and the infinite, but also was wondering the relationship to the finite and strategies around that. He quite saw beautifully in the basketball long-distance shots that the only reasons that they were taking place at that moment because it was at the finite moment when actually time already elapsed, and only at that moment they could take this shot because it's if you look at strategic, like game theory, the chance they actually would make this shot is quite impossible, and during the normal elapse of the game, it would be quite disadvantageous to take this shot. But now at this position, when time has elapsed, this pattern can create only because they are beyond the finite.
I find it interesting. I'm not going to answer anything, but I find it interesting because I left a tiny 2 words out when I called you, saying. Speaking about the ongoing composition, aka time, those are the 2 words that I left out. So there must be something on your mind about that.
Yeah. Well, I think that, that's like also the knowledge of the amount of time that is there. Like, I don't even, a basketball is 40 minutes, I think, NBA game. Or no, that's a lot, 60, 15, I can't remember if they went to 12. Anyway, whatever. So when you start the game, you know how long it's going to be. So, this is also kind of bizarre because, of course, it's sort of like the meaningfulness of each amount of time is always changing depending on how much time has elapsed, as you're saying. Like, so then if the game is tied and there's 5 seconds left, then suddenly someone might have the moment to make this crazy shot that they would never take before that time.